As we have seen in the previous video, the B1 Bis was developed from the previous complex Char B1 tank, with an emphasis on heavier armor protection in order to resist newer anti-tank guns being deployed by various militaries during the 1930s. The hull still retained the core characteristics of the B1 as well as its 75mm howitzer armament and complex steering system, but was significantly up-armored by an additional 20mm. Changes extended beyond the hull though, as we'll see within this video, notably the turret. The B1 Bis used an APX-4 cast turret. It was directly based on the APX-1 used in the B1 but incorporated a number of changes. In comparison to the APX-1, the APX-4 went up from 40 to 56mm of armor on all sides, at an angle of 20 degrees in the sides and rear. The observation cupola was 48mm thick while the roof was 30, and the turret ring diameter stayed about the same at a little over 1 meter. Under electric rotation, the turret could rotate at 10 degrees per second and would therefore do a complete rotation in about 36 seconds. When rotated by hand, either for fine adjustments or as a backup, a full rotation of the crank would move the turret about 2.2 degrees, and a full 360-degree rotation of the turret would take about a minute by a trained and focused commander. The APX-4's vision optics can be divided into two, those present within the turret's main body and those present in the observation cupola. Within the turret itself, there were two PPL observation devices, one on each side, as well as the L762 sights for the 47mm gun. The observation cupola was fully rotatable independently from the turret, being rotated by hand, with a full rotation being performed in just about 12 seconds on average. It included the most observation devices: a periscopic binocular providing a field of view of 8.91 degrees and a 4x magnification, and a PPL RX-160 episcope similar to the one found in the hull, giving a horizontal view of about 68 degrees and a vertical view of +2 and -22 degrees. The last was a vision slit 120mm wide and 10mm high, giving a field of view of 114 degrees and coverable with 24mm thick armored shutter when not in use. Only a single crewman was in the turret, the commander. He entered the tank through the side hatch, as did the other 3 crew members, but the APX-4 turret featured a hatch at the back, meant to allow the removal of the gun. However, it could be opened and then serve as a seat for the commander looking over the turret. This allowed him to observe the battlefield more efficiently, as well as evacuate the tank if needed. The B1 Bis's main armament was the 47mm SA-35 L32 main gun. Newly developed by APX, it offered far better performances than the 47mm SA-34 used in the B1. The 47mm SA-35 gun used in the APX-4 turret an L724 sight with a 4x magnification, a field of view of 11.84 degrees, and range drums of up to 1600 meters for AP shells. The reticle used was first V-shaped and later plus or minus shaped. The standard issue shells for the 47mm SA-35 were the Obus de Rupture Model 1935 and the Obus Explosif Model 1932, both 47 by 193mm. At first, 50 would be carried within the tank, but during production, ammunition stowage would be improved to 62 and later 72 shells. The Obus de Rupture Model 1935 was an armor-piercing capped shell. German testing of the shell showed an armor penetration of 40mm slanted back at 30 degrees at a range of 400 meters, and this was far superior to the penetration capability of the SA-34. The Obus Explosif Model 1932 was a high explosive shell. It weighed 1.4 kilograms, including 142 grams of explosives, and was fired at a muzzle velocity of 590 meters per second. Secondary armament was provided in the form of a coaxial MAC-31 Type E machine gun, the shorter tank version of the MAC-31, which had been designed for fortification use. 4,800 7.5mm rounds were carried within the B1 Bis, later increased to 5,200 during production, feeding 150-round drums. Differentiating the B1 from its later, much more common evolution, the B1 Bis, can be somewhat of a hard task. When looking at the photos of the B1 pre-1940, the difference is particularly easy to make. The B1s feature the SA-34, a shorter gun with a recoil cylinder, while the B1 Bis feature the longer and cylinderless SA-35. However, because the B1s were refitted with the SA-35 during the Phony War, identifying them becomes a much harder task. Some elements can still give it away, but they are typically quite dependent from the angle at which the tank is viewed. At 500mm, the tracks on the B1 Bis were 40mm wider than the B1. This, however, is typically quite hard to see. Easier to distinguish is that the mount for the 75mm gun, as well as the driver's post, are a lot more distinct from the rest of the front plates on the B1 than in the B1 Bis, mostly as a consequence of the armor being thickened on the Bis model. The vision slots on the turrets are different, and a few minor details around the suspension can be used to identify the vehicles if nothing else allows it. The first B1 Bis was completed by Renault in February 1937 and was numbered N201. The production of the B1 Bis was sluggish, particularly in 1937 and 38, as production was still setting up. Only 27 B1 Bis were completed in 1937 and just 25 in 1938. By September 1939, 84 B1 Bis had been produced in total. Production only really started to rise in 1939, with mobilization efforts seeing more resources pooled into military production. 100 B1 Bis were completed in 1939. Production still proved to be very low in comparison to the mass of tanks ordered, though. In 1940, the number of vehicles produced always remained slightly below the number expected. During 1 month, 27 were delivered from the 41 that were expected, for example. March 1940 was the most productive month in the history of B1 Bis production, with 45 examples completed from the 47 that were expected. Despite France beginning to fall apart in the same month, May was also very productive, with 42 vehicles completed, and overall, the production of the B1 Bis was rising at a respectable pace by the point it was brutally interrupted by the German invasion, with 27 vehicles delivered in June being the last. Overall, around 369 B1 Bis are estimated to have been delivered to the French military. Renault was by far the most productive manufacturer, with 182 examples. FCM made 72, FAMH made 70, and AMX made 47, and Schneider just 30. The reason behind the B1 Bis' slow production was because of how complex it was, and its use of many elements which were typically produced by one manufacturer only, but had to be delivered to each of the 5 assembly chains. The worst offender in that regard was the Nader steering system, though the APX-4 cast turret was also a major cause. This meant at the outbreak of hostilities in World War II, only a few units were outfitted with the B1 Bis. The first orders of the B1 Bis usually comprised 35 vehicles, as each battalion would operate 35. The first unit to receive the B1 Bis was the 1st Battalion of the 510e des Chars du Combat, which was outfitted with its tanks in a period of more than a year, from February 1937 to March of 1938. Deliveries of the second batch of B1 Bis started in January of 1939 towards the 1st Battalion of the 508th. Those deliveries were completed in the summer, and deliveries then started towards the 2nd Battalion of the 512th, which was still receiving its tanks by the outbreak of the war, as only 84 B1 Bis were completed by that point. By the year it was introduced in service in 1937, and even still by 1940, the B1 Bis was a very capable tank when looking simply at its firepower and armor protection. Armament-wise, the B1 Bis had the most powerful tank gun mounted in any serial-produced tanks in French service, the 47mm SA-35. Besides the B1 Bis itself, there were few vehicles in the world that would prove to be hard targets for it. By 1940, the British were introducing the Matildas, and the Soviets the KVs and T-34s, which would have proved to be mostly invulnerable to the French gun. However, when looking at France's relevant opponents at the time, Germany and Italy, the 47mm would still prove to be able to penetrate any vehicle with ease, and was a superior anti-tank gun to what was mounted in tanks like the Panzer III or Panzer 38T. The hull-mounted 75mm was also the most powerful infantry support weapon in France's arsenal, save perhaps for the slightly longer 75 mounted in the very rare FCM-2C Super Heavies. Its firepower against fortifications and entrenched positions was considerable. Looking purely on paper, a B1 Bis combines into 1 tank and 4 crew members what the German army would need 2 tanks and 10 crew members to do. The B1 Bis' armor protection was also far superior to those of German tanks at the time. Overall, it was almost invulnerable to German 37mm, and the Panzer IV's short 75 could occasionally prove a threat, but was neither powerful nor accurate enough to be relied upon to knock out the French tank. The major elements of the Wehrmacht which could challenge the B1 Bis were heavier towed guns, like the infamous 88mm Flak, but also the 105mm Leichtgefühlbehauptze. Those theoretical advantages and hard statistics the B1 Bis offers over the German tanks of the era, however, paint a far more glamorous reality of the tank than what its operation was really like. Though powerful, the B1 Bis was plagued with a large number of flaws that made it a far from perfect or even great operational vehicle. The B1 Bis was a very complex tank for the era. As a result, it required some extensive crew training to be operated properly. A variety of circumstances resulted in most crews, however, being quite unfamiliar with the vehicle when they had to take it into combat during the campaign of France. The first was the inadequacy of French training tank battalions when compared to the complexity of the B1 Bis. By the late 1930s, the standard tank used to initiate conscripts and soldiers to tanks was still the antiquated Renault FT from the First World War. The FT was arguably a decent tank to introduce crews to a two-men light infantry tanks, like the lights of the R35, R40, H35, H39, and the FCM-36. However, the jump in complexity from the FT to the B1 or B1 Bis was tremendous, with the two machines having little in similarities. Notably, drivers on the FT would just have to drive, while on the B1 Bis they would also have to man the 75mm. The commander on an FT was busier than the driver, but still vastly less so than on the B1 Bis. While FT commanders would spot enemy vehicles and operate the turret armament by themselves, they would also have to command the fire of the 75mm on the B1 Bis. While some training battalions received very few B1 and B1 Bis tanks during the Phony War in order to give the crew vehicles much closer to what they would have to operate, this was done quite late and in tiny numbers. Another major issue is that a large quantity of B1 Bis used in the campaign of France were delivered to their units from a couple of months to mere days before they were used in the campaign. Many crews did not have the time to go through the transitional period that would be needed to truly get accustomed to the B1 Bis after being trained on FTs. A US Army attaché to France during the Phony War had estimated about 6 months would be needed to properly train a B1 Bis crew, a time that very few operators of the tank actually had before they went into combat during the campaign of France. The results of this poor training were considerable. Notably, bad familiarity with the Nader steering system had some tragic consequences, with crews not realizing that the mechanical castor oil used for the operation of the system did not have the same properties as pharmaceutical castor oil, meaning if the latter was used in times of need, it would cause breakdowns that could immobilize the whole vehicle. The terrible ergonomics of the B1 Bis, with both the commander and driver being utterly overtasked, was an even heavier burden on crews which were not properly trained. Indeed, the commander, typically an officer, assumed in the B1 Bis, like a lot of French tanks, a large quantity of different tasks. The commander was the main spotting force in the vehicle, tasked with identifying enemy targets through the commander's cupola, as well as making tactical decisions and ordering the crew, a more complicated task than usual due to the presence of a whole 75mm gun, of which the commander would typically order the firing as well. On top of that, the commander also had to be the gunner and loader for the 47mm and the machine gun mounted in the turret. In practice, this meant commanders would have to move position from looking outside from the cupola to putting themselves behind the gun to load and fire it, while at the same time having to analyze the situation around them and give orders to the whole crew. The difference in comparison to the division of tasks in German Panzer III and IVs are enormous, and this utter overtasking of the commander had significant consequences on the B1 Bis and its performance. Typically, the awareness of enemy targets in the tactical situation was far worse on French tanks than a German one, even if the B1 Bis had the relative privilege of having a radio, something that many other French tanks lacked. The operation of the 47mm was also severely impaired, with the gun being fired at a much lower rate as technically possible, as low as 2 rounds per minute when you could technically achieve 15. The driver also assumed a greater variety of tasks than usual in the tank, having not only to just drive and steer the vehicle as would be expected, but also act as the gunner for the hull-mounted 75, meaning even more training and a larger range of tasks to worry about when in combat. The commander would be able to give orders to the driver through both a voice tube and a set of electrical lights codifying simple commands. And though these worked decently, they did not entirely replace the old practice which had been used since the FT, having the commander kick the driver's shoulders. The other 2 hull crew members had somewhat of an easier time but would typically still require extensive training and be kept very busy. The loader was placed behind the 75mm, and he would be tasked with trying to repair the engine in case of potentially repairable breakdowns, which would be done through the access corridor without actually leaving the tank. They were also tasked with handing 47mm shells stored in the hull up to the commander. In short, they assumed a variety of roles which would typically be quite occasional but were varied in nature. The 4th crew member was a radio man, and that's all he had to worry about. And while this may seem like a simple task, it should be noted that most B1 Bis were only fitted with Morse radios. Only about 100 B1 Bises received a radio capable of voice communication. The driver, loader, and radio man were typically all non-commissioned officers, and though the crew of the B1 Bis in operation was 6 to 7 crewmen were actually assigned to the vehicle, with the additional tankers being tasked with helping with maintenance and replacing out-of-action crew members. Some B1 Bis would actually carry one of these additional crewmen inside the hull, and though this made everything quite cramped, they could take up certain tasks like handing shells to the commander. To be expected for the heaviest and most complex mass-produced French tank of 1940, the B1 Bis was very thirsty and required fairly extensive maintenance work. The fuel used in the B1 Bis' engine was 85-octane aviation fuel, which made sense since it used a bisected aircraft engine. It could not run effectively on most other fuels of the French military. This wasn't really a problem in itself, but the poor French logistical services during the 1940 campaign meant that getting fuel to the units often proved hazardous, and a large number of B1 Bis ended up scuttled or left behind in strategic positions after running out of fuel. The B1 Bis had retained the same 400-liter fuel tank as the B1, but the engine was raised in power to accommodate the additional weight, and that meant it was thirstier, with the 400 liters being typically expended in 6 to 8 hours depending on the conditions of operation. This was obviously not good, and a solution needed to be found in order to allow the B1 Bis to have a better range. This came in the form of the Lorraine 37L armored supply vehicle. Developed from 1936 onward as part of a call to produce an armored supply tractor for the infantry's tank, the Lorraine 37L was a fully tracked and armored vehicle which was able to tow a trailer containing 570 liters of fuel, raising the range of the B1 Bis quite considerably. Each company of 10 B1 Bis was to be allocated 6 Lorraine 37L. This was not entirely fulfilled by 1940 though. The 1st and 2nd DCR, the oldest armored divisions of the French infantry, appear to have had a complete or near-complete complement of Lorraine 37Ls, but the newer 3rd and 4th DCR did not. That concludes this second video on the B1 Bis. After we have examined the capabilities of this vehicle, the next and last video in the series will be dedicated to the B1 Bis' service history and the variety of battles it was engaged in. You may find a quantity of other articles, as well as a complete one on the B1 Bis on our website. Ratings, comments, and subscriptions would be greatly appreciated. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit. We also have a link to our Discord community server in the description below. If you would like to help us continue and refine our work, also continue donating to our Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to help us enhance and design new articles and features for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.